Boker Tov, we're on Daf Ayin Zayin Amud Beis in the middle of the Amud 77b, and we're up to Hotera. Let's see if we can find Hotera. The structure of the Amud is such that it has a thin lines and then the wide lines. And with regard to the wide lines, we're going to count down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the first word in the line is al. And then you'll see the third word in the line is Hotera. So we're 5 lines down in the wide lines on Daf Ayin Zayin Amud Beis. So the Gemara says, Hotera zbachim diika olim ela omer shtei alechem deleka olim mai ika lemeimar. The Gemara tried to defend and reconcile Rebby Yehoshua's shita with our Mishna. And offhand, there seems to be a contradiction between the two, because Rebby Yehoshua was of the opinion that ein tzitz meratza. Now, if you hold the tumah dechuya bציבור, then you need ריצוי tzitz. And Rebby Yehoshua is of the opinion that ein basar ein dam, and there's no ריצוי tzitz on the achila. So the Gemara answered that we can split the achila into two. The basar divides into, number one, achilas mizbeach, which is that part of the emurim that is burnt on the mizbeach, and achilas adam. And that's in all korbanos except for olah, the part that's eaten by, whether it be the kohanim or whether it be the bailim. When Rebby Yehoshua said that ein hatzitz meratza al ha'ochlin, what he had in mind was the achilas adam. As far as achilas mizbeach is concerned, as far as the emurim is concerned, yes, even Rebby Yehoshua would agree that there is a power in the tzitz to be meratza al tumah, and it makes the basar for the emurim, which is called olim meaning that it goes up on the mizbeach, into tar, as if it was tar. It's not tar, it's tamei, but it's considered like it's tar. And therefore, we could be zorek the dam, because there will be basar that's roy lahakrava, in this case, al gabi mizbeach, through the mechanism of tzitz meratza al ha'olim. Again, the tzitz is not meratza on ha'ne'echolim lachilas adam, but on the olim l'gabi mizbeach. So then when we go back to our Mishnah, we can reconcile our Mishnah with Rebby Yehoshua. And if, for example, Rov hatzibur tmeim and Tumah dechuya bציבור, we can bring the Tumah, we could bring the carbon b'tumah, that carbon tzibur, like for example the carbon Pesach. And even though the basar is going to contract Tumah, and there's no other way out, there's no other choice, nevertheless the tzitz will be meratza, a partial ריצוי, but that is a sufficient ריצוי to allow us to be zorek the dam, because we have the ריצוי on the olim, on the basar that goes on to the mizbeach. So if you were to draw a picture of this, for children, it's very good to draw pictures. So you'd have the zrika of the dam, and you'd have the haktara of the basar albeit b'tumah al gabi mizbeach. So when we split the basar into these two subcategories, we have a dam that could be connected to a basar, and that's what we need. We need that the zrika reach its fruition with basar, and in this case, the mizbeach will get that basar. And how? After all, the basar is tamei. That's through tzitz meratza. And we made a mistake when we thought that according to Rebby Yehoshua, tzitz is totally powerless with regard to the basar. That's not true. the tzitz is not only maratza for vis-a-vis the akrov and the zrika, but it's also maratza vis-a-vis the basar, at least partially so, relative to that basar, which is brought on top of the mizbeach, the emurim. And that's enough to, so to speak, free up the zrika, to allow the zrika to take place, because that zrika will culminate in basar that's royal hotara through the agency of the tzitz. So the Gemara says, "Hatenach zbachim." Why? The ika olim, with regard to a zevach of a behema, we can work out Rebby Yehoshua because there is a basar that's ol al gabi mizbeach, and vis-a-vis that basar, tzitz is marata, so that the zrika now partners or pairs up with the basar, and there is basar that's roy lemizbeach. But again, that's only because the tzitz is maratza vis-a-vis basar that's ol al gabi mizbeach. Again, keep in mind, we're still maintaining Rebby Yehoshua's position that einat tzitz maratza al nechalim. We're just qualifying that, and it only applies to the nechalim lachilas adam. But with regard to achilas adam, there is no tzitz maratza al aduma, even in this new formulation of Rebby Yehoshua. So the Gemara therefore asks, "Ela omer ushtei alechem deleka olim mai ikolim neimar." In the case, and we'll start with Minchas HaOmer, we have nothing that goes on to the Mizbeach to link up, again, pardon my use of the words dam, here put dam into inverted commas, which I'll explain in just a second, but there's no partnering of dam with basar that is ola al gabi mizbeach. Okay, what do I mean by dam? I mean, there is no dam in the case of a korban mincha. Korban mincha is brought from a kobetz of grains, of solas. But the answer is that, once again, we need a kind of a picture board here, but what we have in zbachim, meaning in behemos, we have its parallel in menachos. So in zbachim, what you have is zrika, and then you have hotara say murim, and then you have achilas basar, but achilas adam, except for nola, right? The parallel in menachos is kmitza, meaning if you have zrika on one side of the board, its parallel in menachos is kmitza. And just like the zrika takes the dam of the zevach onto the mizbeach, so too that part of the mincha which is subject to kmitza, that kometz, is also burnt on the mizbeach. Okay, good. So given that parallel, you've got zivche behema on top with zrika, and below it you have a mincha with kmitza. In the case of zivche behema, the dam is now related to that basa which is ola al gabi mizbeach. But in the case of kmitza, you don't have anything that's ola al gabi mizbeach, because the rest of the mincha, which is called shirayim in the language of Chazal, is nechal lekohanim. So the kohanim, the zichrei kahuna, will eat the balance or the shirayim of the mincha. But we need something that's ol al gabi mizbeach, because you remember that Rebby Yehoshua holds that einat tzitz maratza al nechalim, meaning nechalim la'adam. So the shirayim of the mincha, although it's nechal li'adam, but there's absolutely zero that is ol al gabi mizbeach. Again, you'll ask me, what do you mean there's nothing ol al mizbeach? The kmitza itself is burnt on the mizbeach. Yeah, but the kmitza is that which effectuates the kapara. It's the machap, the ריצוי, the karma, like the zrika. We now have to link that up with that which goes on the mizbeach. And we have no possibility of linking it with anything that goes on the mizbeach. So therefore, how could our Mishnah, in enumerating and listing all the karbanos that override Tumah in a case where Rov Hatzibur Tamei, it includes on the list Minchas HaOmer. The Minchas HaOmer, according to Rebby Yehoshua, could not possibly be kosher in the case of Rov Hatzibur Tameim, because there's nothing to link up the kmitza with something that's ol al gabi mizbeach, because the shirayim is not ol al gabi mizbeach, it's nechal zichrei kuhuna. How much more so, moving on to the next subcategory, do we have a problem with shtei alechem on Chag HaShavuos, which is also enumerated in our Mishnah as a karban whose hakrava overrides tumah in a case of rov tzibur tmeim. Because once again, in the case of shtei alechem, we have nothing that's ol al gabi mizbeach. And in the language of the Achronim, they write that, just one second if I can find this. Yud Ches. First of all, as we said before, al basar nechal eina tzitz meratza, but that doesn't bother Rebby Yehoshua in the cases of zivchei behema, because there is going to be a ריצוי tzitz on the murim, and that's enough to justify and validate the zrika the dam. But then we get to the cases of minchas haomer and shtei alechem. So as we said, in minchas haomer, there's the kmitza, but after that, there's nothing that's ol al gabi mizbeach. Everything else is nechal li'odno, which is the shirayim. Well, there's no tzitz meratza on nechal li'odno. And shtei alechem, ein bohem shum chelek hakorev lemizbeach. There's nothing of the shtei alechem that's put on the mizbeach. At least in the case of a mincha, they have the kometz that's burnt on the mizbeach, but not in the case of shtei alechem. Elenitonim b'shleimusam lachilas hakohen. All we have in the case of shtei alechem is achilas kohen. I mean, again, we're not going through the whole sugya of shtei alechem and exactly, we'd have to learn Masechet Menachos. But be that as it may, we know that in shtei alechem, there's nothing at all that goes on to mizbeach. And if that be the case, then in the case of tumah, where Rebby Yehoshua is saying that the tzitz is going to save us and validate akrava because of something that's muktar al gabi mizbeach, well, guess what? In shtei alechem, you don't even have a takeoff point, because there's nothing that is brought on the mizbeach. So the Gemara answers, Amri ki Amar Rebby Yehoshua nami BIyun tarte. When Rebby Yehoshua made his statement and formulated his principle that you need, in order to be zorik the dam, you need also that the basar, not only the dam, could be re'uyim limizbeach, and in the case of the dam, it's royal limizbeach because the basar is royal limizbeach and the basar is royal limizbeach through the mechanism of ריצוי tzitz. That's only zbachim. He only required this condition that there be what we call harte, both dam and basar. That was only in terms of behema. Behema shechted, we bring it as a karban, and now we split up the zrikas hadam on the one hand and the haktaras habasar on the other hand. We need both. How does the basar become royal haktaras? As we said before, the tzitz is meratz al atum. Aval, but in the case of menachos, lo amar. Rebby Yehoshua concedes that in the case of a mincha, you could be makir of the kometz even if there's no shirayim. There's nothing left over. Like we've been talking about a case where the shirayim contracted tumah. Forget about that. What happens in a case where the shirayim got lost? We will still be makir the kometz. So in minchas haomer, the only ריצוי that we need is on the kometz itself. It's as if to say that in Zbachim, we cannot reduce the power of the Hakrava to the Zrika alone. We need Zrika plus Basar. But in the case of Hakravas Menachos, all we need is the Komets. If the Shirayim are gone, the Hakravas HaKomets is still absolutely valid. And on the Komets, we apply the mechanism of ריצוי Tzitz. So here's the contrast, which the Gemara is suggesting now, that Rebby Yehoshua never required in the case of Menachos that we have something that's muktar on the Mizbeach other than the Komets, and it's royal akrav al gabi Mizbeach, and therefore you have to activate ריצוי Tzitz, which we can't do in this case because there's nothing left besides the Komets that's brought on the Mizbeach. Everything else, the Shirayim is nechal li'adam. There's no ריצוי Tzitz on achilas adam. And now you're telling me, well, we don't need A plus B in the case of Menachos as we do in the case of Zbachim, Zivchei Behema. And Zivchei Behema, we need not just the Zrikas Adam, but also the Basar that's be roy l'aktor al gabi Mizbeach. And only the two together will justify the karma and validate it. Not so in the case of Menachos. Gemara says that's an untenable position. But Menachos lo Omar, but nan, we have a Mishnah, and you guessed it, it's in Masechet Menachos. Nitma'u shiareha avdu shiareha kimidas Rabbi Eliezer, according to Rabbi Eliezer's logic, because he holds that even in Zevach, you could be zorek the dam of the carbon, even if there's no basar that's raw, is kshera. Then we can take this mincha, we can be maktir the komets, we have no shirayim, but that's fine, because he never accepted the principle of him ein basar, ein dam, and according to Rabbi Eliezer, remember he derived from that extra pasuk of Tishbo, that the dam is an independent agency, an entity that exists on its own, irrelevant to the basar, so the basar can get lost, or tamei, and Rabbi Eliezer would still maintain that the carbon is kosher and you can do the drikas adam. And in its parallel case in Menachos, if there was a komets and you could do the kmitza, that's sufficient. And therefore, even though the shirayim have contracted tumah or they're lost, they're off the face of the earth, we can still bring the komets, and kmitza is enough, just like drikas adam is enough in zbachim. However, says the Mishnah, Kimidas Rabbi Yehoshua, according to the Shita Rabbi Yehoshua, who holds that you need both dam and basar, is psula. You cannot be maktir the komets of the mincha, because where's the basar? The only basar that we have is the shirayim, which is nechal lekanim. But the shirayim are lost, or alternatively, the shirayim have contracted tumah, and there's no ריצוי Tzitz on necholim, meaning necholim li adam. So you don't have the element of basar in the equation. But we see clearly from this Mishnah that Rabbi Yehoshua needed, even in the case of mincha, to attach the substitute for dam, meaning the kmitza, to basar. Now again, if there was no issue with tumah, so we have basar. What's the basar? We have the balance of the mincha, which is called shirayim. That's fine. But if the shirayim are lost and they contract tumah, then the Mishnah insists that Rabbi Yehoshua would have to invalidate the komets, the kmitza, because it doesn't link up and culminate in any sort of achila, not even the achila of Adam, of shirayim, because it's tamei or it's lost. But in the case of tamei, you might have thought, let's apply the principle of ריצוי Tzitz, but there's no ריצוי Tzitz on necholim. In any event, the way that the Gemara understands this Mishnah Menachos, it's absolutely clear that Rabbi Yehoshua's principle about A plus B, and you need two requirements in the case of Zbachim dam plus basar. In the case of menachos, the komets plus the shirayim, that applies to menachos just as well as it applies to zbachim. Says the Gemara, no. We're misinterpreting the Mishnah in menachos. What did the Mishnah mean when it said Kemidas Rabbi Yehoshua Psula? Those are the key words that we want to focus on. What it meant was Kemidas velo Kemidas. Now that phrase, Kemidas shalo Kemidas, lo Kemidas, means that yes, we accept Rabbi Yehoshua, but we extend Rabbi Yehoshua's shita beyond Rabbi Yehoshua himself. And that's what it means, Kemidas velo Kemidas. Kemidas, Rabbi Yehoshua Devin and Tarte. We're going to accept the logic of Rabbi Yehoshua that you need, let's take Zivchei Behema, dam plus basar, and we're going to apply it to menachos as well. We need kmitza plus shirayim. Velo Kemidas means Rabbi Yehoshua himself. To either Rabbi Yehoshua himself, he was of the opinion that zbachim Amar, in Tzvachim I need dam plus basar, but benachos lo Amar. We don't need that the shirayim be re'uyim le'achila. All we need is the kmitza, and the kmitza stands alone on its own. So it's fascinating because now, if we would take what's it called in when they make the cheshbonos, a sub calculation. There's a phrase for it. Anyway, if at this point in the Gemara we would calculate what we have actually three shitos. We have Rabbi Eliezer, who even in the case of Zivchei Behema separates the dam from the basar, and the dam is independent of the basar. We have the shita of the Tana of the Mishnah Menachos, that on the other polar extreme, that just like in Zivchei Behema we need both Zrika and Basar, so too in Menachos we need Kmitza plus Shirayim. And then in the middle, we have Rabbi Yehoshua himself. Rabbi Yehoshua didn't go all the way to the other polar extreme, although in Zivchei Behema we need dam plus Basar, but in Menachos, all we need is the Kmitza, the Komets. We don't need the Shirayim. So the Gemara is not happy with this. Did I skip anything? Let me just see. Either Rabbi Yehoshua bin Zbachim Omar Benachos Lo Omar. I skipped this. The Ilu Haitana, the author of the Mishnah Benachos Savar, he's not going to be mechalek to distinguish between Zbachim and Benachos. I feel Benachos we need not only the Kmitza but also the Shirayim. So the Gemara is not happy. Umanu Haitana Dekai Kavaseh Umachmir Tfemine. You get the feeling that the Gemara here is very inhibited. It's like, what word can I use? The Gemara is very conservative and immediately rejects revolution. This is too revolutionary. Oh, you have a Tana that accepted Rabbi Yehoshua and went a step further. I mean, we don't know of a third Tana. We know that there's a fundamental machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua about the principle of tarte, which means in the case of Zbachim, im ein basar ein dam, and in the case of Menachos, im ein shirayim, ein komets. That's the machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua. Now you're introducing a third possibility. Rabbi Yehoshua differentiated between Zbachim and Menachos, and the Tana took Rabbi Yehoshua to its logical conclusion. Where is such a Tana? And maybe the Gemara is inhibited because where do we find, a third Tana that accepted Rabbi Yehoshua, but then was more machmer than Rabbi Yehoshua himself? But I don't believe that this alone would have upslugged our possibility, the ode, but we have a brisa, and the brisa is really outspoken. Rabbi Yossi, Roa Anias Divrei Rabbi Eliezer b'menachos zbachim, v'divrei Rabbi Yehoshua b'zvachim u'b'menachos. Again, this is a very ambiguous statement of Rabbi Yossi. We're going to have a whole sugya to try to understand, not today, but later on, what Rabbi Yossi has in mind. But what we do know is the following, that Divrei Rabbi Eliezer b'zvachim, and the Brisa says, what are the words, so to speak? What is the position of Rabbi Eliezer with regard to Zbachim? Shaya Omer Dam Afal Pi Shein Basar. Fine. B'divrei Rabbi Yehoshua b'Zvachim, right? Because Rabbi Yossi had Divrei Rabbi Eliezer b'Zvachim and Divrei Rabbi Yehoshua b'Zvachim, and that's Shaya Omer Mein Dam Ein Basar. Ein Basar Ein Dam. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer b'Menachos, but wait a second. Rabbi Yossi points out that he's happy with Rabbi Eliezer's position on Menachos and with Rabbi Yehoshua's position on Menachos. Again, how to figure that out, we'll have to see later on. But for our purposes, he sets up a parallel machlokus between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua in the case of Menachos, parallel to the case of Zbachim. And Rabbi Eliezer b'Menachos haya omer kometz afal pi shein shirayim. However, Divrei Rabbi Yehoshua b'Menachos haya omer im ein kometz ein shirayim, im ein shirayim ein kometz. It's absolutely clear that Rabbi Yossi's transmission of the sheet of Rabbi Yehoshua was both in Zbachim and in Menachos. So just like in Zbachim, if there's no Basar, there's no Dam. So too in Menachos, if there's no Shirayim, there's no Kometz. So we're in a no-win situation. Our back is against the wall. So the Gemara says, Ella, now the Gemara is, one second, is this the, I just want to make sure I'm not jumping the gun. Yeah, now the Gemara is rewriting the text. Yamam is changing the whole business. Until this juncture, we've been assuming that according to Rabbi Yehoshua, the tzitz is not meratz on nechol. Again, we whittled that down a little bit because we said it is meratza on the achilas mizbeach of the murim, but on nechol li'adam, tzitz doesn't have the power to be meratza if the basar is tamei. Now the Gemara reformulates Rabbi Yehoshua. Ella, even though Rabbi Yehoshua holds that in the case of Menachos, you can't be makriv until you have shirayim re'uyim, don't ask a kashma on Mishna, because kasav Rabbi Yehoshua hatzitz meratza al ha'olim ve al ha'achilos. Rabbi Yehoshua accepted and expanded the power of the tzitz to be meratza on either that part of the carbon that's brought on the mizbeach, or even the part of the carbon that's nechal li'adam and it's not brought on the mizbeach. Rizui tzitz is machshiv, even that part that's nechal l'kohanim, or l'bailim in the case of shlomim, and it makes it into roy. The magic of the tzitz operates even as far as nechalim is concerned for achilas adam, and therefore, in the case of minchas ha'omer, we're going to say that even if it's tamei, in the case of rov tzibur tmeim, we can bring the minchas ha'omer because the shirayim are nechalim l'kohen. How? Because the tzitz is meratz al tuma, even as far as nechalim is concerned. He writes here, Ukidas Rabbi Eliezer bebraisa li'el v'lo kfi shesavar Gemara ha'ata shel Rabbi Yehoshua ein hatzitz meratz ala ochlin. Okay, that confirms what we suggested in the Gemara. We thought until now that it's only Rabbi Eliezer who holds that tzitz is meratz ala necholim. Now we're saying even Rabbi Yehoshua accepted that principle. If that be the case, then you've really whittled down the machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua as Amai Kemidas Rabbi Yehoshua Psula. What did Rabbi Yossi mean in the Mishnah Menachos when he says that if the Shirayim of the Mincha are lost or they contracted Tumah, then according to Rabbi Yehoshua, the Mincha is Psula? How could it be that the Mincha is Psula if you're telling me that Tzitz is Maratza even on a Nechal Yadam? The Gemara answers that which it says in the Mishnah Menachos Kemidas Rabbi Yehoshua, that's not relate, right? Kemidas Rabbi Yehoshua Psula in Menachos, that's not relating to Nitmu Ashirayim, but rather Avud V'Sarf, meaning if the Shirayim are completely gone, then we have the principle of Im Ein Dam, of Im Ein Basar Ein Dam, or in the case of Kometz, according to Rabbi Yehoshua Menachos, Im Ein Shirayim Ein Kometz. But this has nothing to do with Tzitz Tzitz, because in fact, if the Shirayim are somewhere in the world, but they've contracted Tumah, the Tzitz would be Maratz on the Shirayim, because now in the new formulation, Rabbi Yehoshua holds that the Tzitz is Maratz on their Cholim. Now, let's go back to the language of the Mishnah that the Gemara just recently quoted. The Mishnah says that, second, where's the language? Oh, here's the language of the Mishnah. It says, Nitmu Shireha, O Avda Shireha. It says explicitly, black and white, that the Shirayim became Tomei. Ella, says the Gemara, Nitma, you have no choice, Laman Ktani, L'Rabbi Eliezer. The only way you could understand that the Mishnah felt compelled to add the case of Nitma is only according to Rabbi Eliezer. That Rabbi Eliezer holds, because again, according to Rabbi Yehoshua, we're saying that if Nitmu Hashirayim, then it sits as Maratz. Why does it say Nitma in the Mishnah? It must be telling me that according to Rabbi Eliezer, the Minchas Kshera, even in the case of Nitmu Hashirayim, and I mean, it doesn't make any sense because according to Rabbi Eliezer, in the case of a Zebach Behema, even if the Basar is completely gone and Tomei and so forth and so on, and there's no ריצוי Tzitz, the carbon is still kosher because Dam Afal Pishein Basar. So how much more so in the case of Menachos, you could have Kmitza, a Kometz without Shirayim. So Gemara says Pshita. Well, why would the Mishnah have to address Rabbi Eliezer about a case where the Shirayim of a Mincha contracted Tumah? Hashta, Yesh Lomar Ovid V'Sarov Delesnahu Umachshir Rabbi Eliezer is Nitma de Isa mi boy. I mean, according to Rabbi Eliezer, Kometz is totally independent of Shirayim. And even if the Shirayim went to heaven, Nevad or Nisraf, nevertheless, there's Kmitza according to Rabbi Eliezer. So how much more so in a case where there are Shirayim, but they contracted Tumah? The Gemara refuses to think that Shirayim Tmeim should be worse than Nevad or Nisraf. Why does the Mishnah feel compelled to tell me a chiddush according to Rabbi Eliezer that even in the case of Nitma Shirayim, the Mincha is still Kshera? Therefore, we have no choice. Ela pshita le Rebby Yehoshua. The only Tana who would that the Mishnah felt compelled to address the issue of nitma hashirayim would only be according to Rebby Yehoshua, because Rebby Yehoshua in Zbachim holds that im ein basar ein da, and applying that to its parallel in Menachos, we would say im ein shirayim ein komnitz, and the Mishnah would therefore be telling me that in Ochinami, according to Rebby Yehoshua, if nitma shirayim psula, you just finished telling me that according to Rebby Yehoshua, tzitz is maratza even on necholim, which means that tzitzes could be maratza if the shirayim are tmeim. The Mishnah says explicitly that nitmu ashirayim psula, the mincha is psula, which can only make sense according to Rebby Yehoshua, because Rebby Yehoshua requires shirayim. So you're going to tell me, okay, nisraf or nevad psula, the mincha is psula because there's no shirayim, and Rebby Yehoshua requires A plus B. But now you're telling me that even in the case of nitma shirayim it's possible. Why is the mincha psula if you're telling me that Rebby Yehoshua accepts the principle that tzitz is maratza ala necholim? The ode, the Gemara continues to pile up the kashas. Tanya, we have a brayso that says Rebby Yehoshua omer kol zbachim shebetorah bein shenitma habasar v'chelev kayim ubein shenitma chelev ubasar kayim zorek es hadam, which means that the brayso is clarifying. According to Rebby Yehoshua, we need two. We need zrika plus basar. Which basar? You have two options. It could either be the basar that is brought on the mizbech murim, or it could be the basar that's never lekan with achilas adam. And therefore, if there's tumah in one of the two, let's say, for example, nitma hachelev, the low nitma basar, the balance of the basar is tahar, so we have achilas adam, that's enough to validate the zrika. Flip side, let's take the case of nitma habasar, but the chelev is still tar. So we have now an achilas mizbech. That's enough to validate the zrika. Says the Gemara, but if we read this carefully, we understand that aval nitmu travayu, if lu yitzuyer, not only the basar contracted tumah, but even the chelev contracted tumah. So we have no achila whatsoever. Lo, then we cannot be zorik to dam. The carbon is completely invalid. Now, if you're telling me that tzitz is maratza ala basar, so then it doesn't matter. Even if, right, there should be ריצוי tzitz as far as the basar or the chelev or both, for that matter. So why are you telling me that if one of the two is contracted tumah, then we can go ahead and be zorik to dam according to Rebby Yehoshua? Because now we have that tarti that we need. We need the connection of zrika with basar. So either one of these two categories of basar, as long as it's tar, is sufficient. But you're implying that if both categories of basar contracted tumah, then Rebby Yehoshua would passel the carbon. There's no possibility of zrika. Why not? You just finished telling me in your reformulation of Rebby Yehoshua that the tzitz is maratza al hanecholim. Alma Kasava, from this brayso we see clearly that Rebby Yehoshua holds that ein hatzitz maratza lo al ha'olim v'lo al ha'chilos. From this brayso, we can conclude that the tzitz is not maratza on the olim, even on that part of the chelev that is burnt on the mizbeach, because again, the Mishna, the brayso implies, it's not an implication, it's black and white, that Rebby Yehoshua requires one of the two to remain tahar, either this or that, the chelev or the basar nech. But if both became tamei, then there's no zrika sadam. Why not? Okay, you'll tell me the tzitz is not maratza ala necholim li'od, but it is maratza on the olim, so then all we need is one of the two, and that would be machshir the carbon and allow for the zrika and let the tzitz be maratza on the olive. So we see mathematically that we have to derive the conclusion based on this brisa that Rebby Yehoshua holds eina tzitz maratza klal al necholim, whether it's necholim mizbeach or necholim liadam. Ella, says the Gemara, li olam Rebby Yehoshua he masnisim. Now a Mishnah can be reconciled even with Rebby Yehoshua. V'lo kasha, we hold that according to Rebby Yehoshua, there's no zrikas adam without the basar. The basar has to be roy leachila, kan lekatchila, kan bdi'eved. In other words, Kiyam Rebby Yehoshua, when did Rebby Yehoshua say that you need basar in order to be zorik the dam? And if ain't basar, ain't dam, we thought that means that the carbon is completely possible. Man, this is a directive and a mandate that Rebby Yehoshua is telling us that if the basar is not roy, don't be zorik the dam. That's what he meant by saying, im ein basar, ein dam. But b'di'eved, if he went ahead and he shouldn't have done so, but he was zorik the dam, and even Rebby Yehoshua would say that b'di'eved the carbon is kosher. Ki Amar Rebby Yehoshua, when Rebby Yehoshua says that we're not going to be zorik the dam, if the basar is not roy, that's only lekatchila. But b'di'eved, lo, Rebby Yehoshua would certainly concede that if the chalev and the basar were both of them were tmeim, and yet he went ahead and he was zorik the dam, the carbon is kosher. But that means that our Mishnah here in Masechet Pesachim is talking about a b'di'eved situation. They went ahead, they were makriv the carbon b'tumah, which they shouldn't have done because no basar is tar. All the basar straight across the board. You know, the chalef haktara and the achilas ha carbon. You know, of the Pesach. It's all tameh, and therefore they shouldn't have been makriv of the carbon Pesach. However, b'di'eved, if they brought the carbon b'tumah, then they fulfilled the mitzvah of the carbon. Yachsi yedei basar. And as we would say in the language of Kodshim, the carbon was mechaper, the kaparas carbon was achieved and clinched, even though they shouldn't have done it. You know, this sort of sends off, bells, like alarm bells. It rings in my mind because it's not so simple to understand the distinction between Lekhtachila and B'di'eved. I mean, just to give you an example, there's a sugya in a parak in Yivam, it's called mitvas chalitza. And the Gemara differentiates between one kind of nal and another kind of nal. And when it says mitzvahs chalitza and this kind of a nal, it means lechatchila. And Tosfos goes, ballistic. What do you mean lechatchila b'di'eved? Either the chalitza is valid and it's matir the Yivam l'shuk, or it's not. I'm talking about lechatchila or b'di'eved. There's no such thing as lechatchila b'di'eved. In mitzvahs, you could talk about zekelu yaveyu and embellish and beautify the mitzvah, and there's different ways of doing the mitzvah. A lot of Rishonim, not the Rambam so much, but say that to daven at hanetz is a lechatchila dika tefillah, but for the Evan you say if it's after hanetz, difficult. In mitzvahs, you have a clear-cut distinction between lechatchila and b'di'eved. In Dini Momenos, for example, there's no such thing as lechatchila b'di'eved. If you're a gazlan, you're a gazlan. That's all. Return, compensate. In Karbonos, what dimension is the Gemara focused on? If you're talking about the kaparas carbon, so it either is or it isn't. You can't say she's half pregnant. You know what I'm saying? Either the kapara, the carbon is machaper, it's not machaper. You can't talk about Lechatchila B'di'evet. We want to know whether it's valid, it's kosher, or it's not kosher. But apparently the Gemara is focused on another dimension of carbon. Carbon is sort of an overlap. It's not just the kiyum or the chalos kapara, but there's also an element of mitzvah. And we want to do the mitzvah the right way. Again, it's still very difficult to say that to do the mitzvah the right way, according to Rebby Yehoshua, you need not only the dam, but you need the basar. And if the basar is tamei, sai the chalov, the chalovim for the hotara gabi mizbeach, and sai the basar that's meant to be eaten by the kohen, everything is tamei. So you shouldn't be zorik the dam. I mean, like, what kind of Allah is it? And we're not dealing with the rabbanans here, Rabbosa. We're not dealing with some sort of a harchak or a siag, a gzeira de rabbanan. We're afraid if we allow him to do this, then tomorrow he'll do that. I mean, none of the basar is tar. And yet, Rebby Yehoshua is machshir the carbon, which means one of two things. Either Rebby Yehoshua holds that yesh dam below basar, or he holds that the tzitz is meratz al basar. We've already proven conclusively that the tzitz is not meratz al basar according to Rebby Yehoshua. So that's not an option. So we're going to have to say that the carbon is kosher, as Rabbi Eliezer holds the zrika and the dam is independent of the basar. So go ahead and be makar of the carbon. Well, what are you hesitating for? I mean, you've got the dam, you shechted the carbon, you should be zorik the dam. This I don't know. I mean, we'll see the last bit in the sugya. Maybe it'll shed a light. It says, "Minah Tamra Deshani Le Rabbi Yehoshua ben Lechatchila B'di'evet." The Gemara has no problem conceptually, and could accept that Rabbi Yeshua's business about him ein basar ein dam is only a lechatchila halacha. The Gemara is even willing to interpret our Mishna as a b'di'evet situation, which itself is b'di'evet. But we have a problem from a price. We have a textual issue. Textual issue. The Sanya we learned in a brisa. So the Gemara wants to say that if you're inhibited about making this distinction between lechatchila and b'di'evet, I'll prove it to you from a brisa. Nitma basar o shenifsal. So Rashi says that the word nifsal here means that there was a maga of a full yom. Now, it says nitma basar, and then it says nifsal. So apparently there's a special chiddush here in this lower level of tumah, because if I'm not mistaken, if we remember, that a tful yom has the status of a sheni l'tumah, because he already went to mikvah. He's a tful yom. He has to wait till Harav Shemesh, so he can be metame b'maga and make something into a sheni l'tumah. I'll just read to you the note. He says tful yom hu tamei shetava l'tumas v'aday lo ba Harav Shemesh shel yachet tfiloso. V'dinu kisheni l'tumah. So the status of a tful yom is a sheni l'tumah. Now, if he comes in contact with truma, then he makes the truma into a shlishi l'tumah. Okay? Now, a shlishi l'tumah in truma means that the truma is like sula. It's not tmeya really. I mean, there is no shlishi l'tumah even as far as truma is concerned. Oh, so what does it mean here? Where I stop reading in the middle here, he says, "Nikarak dover shemetame acherim." Now, you can't call truma of a shlishi as tamei, because the word tamei means that it could impart and convey tumah down the line, which a shlishi in truma cannot do. Therefore, we call it posel, and it's ton sreifa, but it's not really tummy. Okay, fine. That's in the case of truma. The afshet tful yomu sheni l'tuma, dora nitma b'tful yomu shlishi l'tuma. So as far as truma is concerned, there is no shlishi l'tuma except that it's possible, but it cannot convey tuma and create a reveal l'tuma. Bekachim, that's what I wanted to get to. Davar shu shlishi l'tuma posel es hakodesh. So kachim is one step beyond truma. Right? Truma has a lighter level or status of kodesh than kedushas haguflim mizbeach. So in case of kedushas haguflim mizbeach, if the tful yom comes in contact with the basar, he makes it into a shlishi l'tuma, which is tuma mamish, because a shlishi in kodesh can create a revi. Uposel es hakodesh. Shone tful yom mishar tmeos. Sha'afshu sheni hurak posel v'eno metame. Shedover anogeh b'tful yom afshu nasa shlishi eno metame acherim lios revi. 1 second, I lost the flow of it. Ubekadshim. So again, in the case of truma, we said that it's the shlishi is possible, but in the case of kachim, davar shu shlishi l'tuma posel es hakodesh. Just 1 second, I'm confused. Sorry, tamei is nikud davar shu posel davar shu atzmo tamei ach eno metame acherim. Okay. Now, tful yom was a shenu to posel es hatruma v'nigiyoso. But posel es hatruma is not the same as tamei. So you would not consider it as nitma basar. Okay, fine. But we're not talking about truma here. We're talking about kachim. Kachim kam davar shu shlishi l'tuma posel es hakodesh. Just 1 second. Sha'afshu sheni. The tful yom is a sheni l'tuma posel es. Shonet tful yom ishar tumus af shehu sheni urak posel Yeah, but that was only as far as true is concerned. As far as kaju, he can create a shlishi l'tuma. I don't know what he means that a full sheni is not metame kachim. I'm sorry, I apologize. This is baffling to me. I must be reading this wrong. So in any event, let's get back to the Brisa. So Rashi says, we don't have much time. Rashi says that when it says nitma basar ochen nifsal, it means that the basar came in contact with the tful yom, and that passes the kachim. Rashi says that it's nifsal me'achila, even though it's only possible and it's not tamei. Which again, I'm confused because I don't want to confuse you. If I'm confused, you don't have to be confused. But I always thought that was the difference between truma and kachim, that a shlishi in truma is only possible, but a shlishi in tuma is tamei. But Rashi's learning that the shlishi, because the tful yom came in contact with kachim, is possible but not Tomei. So I have to get back to you on that. I have to pay up my chol. Oshi yotza chutz lekloim. Right? Let's say there's a psul yotze. If you take the basar of the zevach outside of the azara, it's possibly din yotze. And what happens to the zevach in all these cases of nitma basar nifsal yotza chutz lekloim? And it says the following: Rebby Eliezer Omer Yizorek. The fact that the basar is out, it's nitma, that doesn't bother Rabbi Eliezer as far as the zrika is concerned, and therefore yizorek. Rabbi Yehoshua Omer lo yizorek. Okay, what does that mean, lo yizorek? Does that mean that im ein basar ein dam, and therefore the carbon is possible? It just says lo yizorek. But that sounds like, we're telling the Kohen not to do the zrika, stay away. But it doesn't mean that the carbon, if he went ahead and did the zrika, is completely possible. That the carbon is machaper, he was yotze his chiyuv, if b'di'eved he went ahead. So we see here that Rebby Yehoshua is differentiating between lekhtחילה and b'di'eved. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? Our Mishna is talking about b'di'eved? Chada dipsula. If you remember the Mishna in Masechet Menachos, it says there kamidas Rebby Yehoshua psula. The word psula, describing the case where the shirayim were tamei in the case of a mincha, that word seems to indicate that the mincha is psula. That if there's no shirayim, then the mincha is psula even b'di'eved. So how can you tell me he's only requiring it l'chakila? And furthermore, even if I'll tell you that Rabbi Yehoshua's moda b'di'eved it's kshera, that interpretation of our Mishna here in Pesachim, that's referring to a b'di'eved situation, it says chamisha dvarim ba'im b'tumah. That's how you state in the Mishnah. Ba'im b'tumah is l'chadchila mashma. There's no way then that you could reconcile our Mishnah with Rabbi Yehoshua, because even if you'll tell me that Rabbi Yehoshua holds that l'chadchila but not b'di'eved, but our Mishnah says that these are ba'im b'tumah, that means even l'chadchila. Ella, and this is where we'll conclude for today, on the top of Daf Ayin Ches, Ella lo kasha kan b'yochid kan b'tzibur. In other words, what you said before is correct. No, the tzitz is not maratza, not on olim, and not on ochlim. There's no ריצוי tzitz. You asked me a kasha, then our Mishnah is against Rabbi Yehoshua. The answer is kan b'yochid v'kan b'tzibur. When Rabbi Yehoshua says that nitma basar, there's no possibility of zrikas hadam, that only applies if a carbon tzibur contracts tumah. Then the din is that nitma basar ein zrikas hadam, not l'chadchila, not b'di'eved. However, our Mishnah of chamisha dvarim ba'im b'tumah is referring to a carbon tzibur. And with regard to a carbon tzibur, Rabbi Yehoshua holds that tumah hutara b'tzibur, and you don't even need ריצוי tzitz. The basar is considered roy lakrava based on the principle, circumventing the need for tzitz, of tumah hutara b'tzibur. And if tumah hutara b'tzibur, even without the tzitz, we can go ahead and be zorek the dam. Because the basar is considered as if it's roy lakrava. Why? Because tumah hutara b'tzibur. The Torah, when it prohibited bringing tamei on the mizbeach, did not refer to a carbon tzibur, which is radical. If you remember, we started the sugya by assuming that everyone, all the Tanaim, agree unanimously that Tumah is the Chuya b'tzibur. Now the Gemara is making a total about face, and Rebby Yehoshua of all people, whose opinion is expressed in our Mishnah, holds that Tumah hutra b'tzibur. So Shem, that's where we'll pick it up tomorrow, please. Okay then. So I wish everyone